Harlem, New York. 10:47 p.m. Saturday, November 12, 1955. The air inside Wells Restaurant on 7th Avenue carries the weight of unspoken threats. It smells like expensive cologne, Cuban cigars, and the metallic tang of fear that follows Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson wherever he conducts business. Outside, the November wind cuts through the streets like a blade. But inside, the temperature is rising. At the corner table, the one with clear sightlines to both exits, sits the most feared man in Harlem. He wears a midnight blue suit, pressed with military precision. His gold watch catches the amber light as he checks the time. Beside him sits the woman who owns his soul. Mame Johnson. 5'6". Honey-colored skin. Eyes that could strip paint from a Cadillac. She wears a burgundy dress that costs more than most men in Harlem make in 6 months, and pearls that once belonged to a downtown socialite who learned the hard way about gambling debts. But tonight, her elegance is weaponized. Tonight, she is conducting an execution. Across from them sits Marcus Heavy Williams, a lieutenant who has been skimming from the numbers racket for 8 months. The evidence sits in a manila envelope between the salt and pepper shakers. Photographs, ledger entries, bank deposit slips. Enough to justify a shallow grave in Queens. Heavy knows it. Bumpy knows it. The entire room knows it. But Mame Johnson speaks first. "Marcus," she says, her voice carrying the authority of a federal judge, "you've been stealing from us. Not from Bumpy. From us." The distinction lands like a physical blow. Heavy's hands start to shake. Bumpy doesn't move, doesn't speak. In his world, theft is punishable by death, executed swiftly and without ceremony. But Mame has claimed jurisdiction, and that changes everything. Because in 23 years of marriage, Bumpy Johnson has never, not once, overruled his wife in public. Heavy tries to explain, tries to justify, tries to negotiate. Mamie listens with the patience of a mortician measuring a corpse for a pine box. When he finishes, she slides the envelope across the table, opens it, and spreads the evidence like playing cards. $67,000, she states. Over 8 months, that averages to $8,375 per month. She looks up at Heavy with eyes that have watched better men beg for mercy. "Do you know what $8,000 means to the families on 125th Street? Heavy swallows hard. He knows where this is going. It means 26 families keep their lights on for a month. It means 43 children eat breakfast. It means 17 mothers don't have to choose between rent and medicine. Her voice never rises above conversational level, but every word lands with the force of a sledgehammer. You didn't just steal from us, Marcus. You stole from them." The moral architecture of her judgment is surgical. She has transformed a business transgression into a community betrayal. In Bumpy's world, you steal. You die. In Mame's world, you steal from children, and death becomes a mercy you have to earn. Bumpy watches his wife orchestrate Heavy's destruction with the detached fascination of a man witnessing his own reflection. This is why he fears her. Not because she might leave him, not because she might betray him, but because she possesses something he lost decades ago in the violence and brutality of building his empire, a moral compass that still points true north. 72 hours later, Heavy Williams would be found in a basement in the Bronx, alive but permanently reminded of the cost of stealing from children. Both his hands would be broken, not shattered, broken with surgical precision so they would heal crooked, ensuring he could never again count money with the dexterity required for theft. The note pinned to his shirt would read, "Courtesy of Mrs. Johnson. Mathematics and morality. Learn both." The story of how Mame Johnson became the only person Bumpy truly feared is a warning that history has tried to hide. If you enjoy these deep dives into the underworld, you can support the channel by buying me a coffee using the link in the description. Your support keeps these investigations alive. Now, let's go back to October 1928, when a young street hustler first met the woman who would teach him that there are forms of power more terrifying than violence. October 1928. Harlem operates like a finely tuned machine of music, money, and calculated menace. The Renaissance burns at full capacity, jazz pouring from basement clubs while a different kind of empire builds in the shadows. Ellsworth Johnson, 21 years old and already carrying the nickname that will define him, understands that survival here requires mathematics, not emotion. Every handshake carries the possibility of violence. Every smile functions as negotiation. He is building his reputation with surgical precision, not as a wild hitter, but as a man who chooses when to strike and never swings twice. The criminal ecosystem operates on delicate balance. Policy numbers serve as the bloodstream of Harlem's underground economy, the poor man's lottery that keeps cash flowing when legitimate banks refuse black customers dignity or credit. Black operators like Madame Stephanie St. Clair control the slips, payouts, and enforcement, but Italian interests from downtown want their piece, bringing intimidation, fire, and bodies in allies as their preferred negotiation tactics. Bumpy's role is maintaining equilibrium. Harlem stays in Harlem's hands, and outsiders who come collecting without permission leave with fewer teeth than they arrived with. Protection rackets run parallel to policy games. Storefront owners pay for safety, for uninterrupted business hours, for the absence of bricks through windows. Bumpy operates with efficiency, avoiding unnecessary spectacle. A quiet word here, a broken wrist there, strategic violence when diplomacy fails. Into this volatile atmosphere walks Mame Hatcher, carrying a leather suitcase, teaching certificates, and composure Bumpy rarely encounters in his world. She arrives from North Carolina, daughter of a school teacher and postal worker, college-educated with the posture of someone raised on rules, books, and discipline. She possesses what few women in Bumpy's sphere have: genuine options. She can find legitimate work in offices, hotels, government programs. She can leave if Harlem disappoints her. She doesn't need a gangster to validate her existence or solve her problems. Their first encounter happens at a rent party on Strivers Row, one of those gatherings where tenants exchange liquor and laughter for rent money. Bumpy attends to maintain visibility. His presence functions as insurance, making people feel safer and behave better. He moves through the crowd with controlled authority, offering nods and half smiles that promise assistance or punishment depending on circumstances. When he notices Mame, he registers details with professional speed: how she stands alone without awkwardness, listens more than speaks, leaves every approaching man with his ego slightly dented. He approaches with his standard method, charm backed by implied threat, light conversation about music and crowds, strategic mentions of his name whispered nearby. He expects her to connect the dots, feel the subtle pressure of his reputation, and adjust accordingly. She responds with complete indifference, not rudeness or fear, just disinterest in the currency he's spending. She answers plainly, asks nothing in return, and resumes her previous conversation. The dismissal lands harder than any insult. When Mame's landlord begins harassing her, raising rent and making crude suggestions about alternative payments, Bumpy sees opportunity. He offers to take care of it, words everyone in Harlem understands. The landlord can be persuaded, humiliated, or removed. Mame listens, lets him finish, then delivers her verdict: "I don't need anyone to fight my battles, and I don't date men who solve problems with their fists." For the first time, Bumpy encounters someone immune to both his charm and menace. 3 weeks later, after repeated failed attempts at impressing her, Mame agrees to dinner with one condition: you come as Ellsworth, not whatever they call you on the streets. No reputation, no stories, no intimidation. Just you. The question haunts him. Without his armor of fear, who is he really? Between 1929 and 1931, Ellsworth Johnson attempts to live as two distinct men in a city that watches everything, held together by discipline and denial. By day, he courts Mame Hatcher with awkward gentility, bringing flowers bought with cash and speaking of futures that don't contain prison cells. By night, he serves as Stephanie St. Clair's primary enforcer, waging territorial war against Italian encroachment with calculated brutality. The compartmentalization requires constant vigilance, changing clothes before seeing Mame, scrubbing his knuckles until bruises fade, crafting elaborate cover stories about legitimate business ventures that never materialize into concrete details. The internal conflict tears at him daily. Stephanie St. Clair demands absolute commitment to the streets, operating with military-style precision where policy numbers function as warfare disguised as arithmetic. Her orders are simple and absolute. Defend the business, defend the block, show no weakness. She views Mame as a dangerous distraction, making Bumpy soft and vulnerable to rivals who will exploit any perceived weakness without mercy. Mame, meanwhile, demands something more terrifying than Stephanie's expectations: complete honesty. She asks direct questions about his work, associates, income sources. She refuses vague answers and polite evasions, interpreting his silence as cowardice rather than protection. The fracture arrives through community channels. Mrs. Patterson, a neighbor who attends the same church as Mame, comes knocking one evening with tears streaming down her face and medical bills clutched in trembling hands. Her 17-year-old son, stupid enough to sell heroin near Public School 139, received a systematic beating from Bumpy's enforcers that left him hospitalized with broken ribs, a shattered jaw, and permanent hearing damage. Mrs. Patterson doesn't seek revenge or justice. She seeks understanding. How could Miss Mame, educated and decent, keep company with the man responsible for her son's destroyed face? Mame visits Harlem Hospital. She sees the wires holding the boy's face together, realizes the suit-wearing gentleman she dines with authorized this brutality against a child from their own community. The confrontation happens in Mame's Sugar Hill apartment, where rent costs more than most Harlem families earn in months. There is no shouting or thrown dishes. Mame sits in her armchair with perfect posture, looking out at the neighborhood Bumpy claims to protect. When he arrives expecting a romantic evening, he finds a tribunal. She asks him one devastating question: "Are you the man who beats children? Or are you the man who takes me to church on Sundays?" Bumpy tries his standard defenses, explaining street justice and necessary violence and the importance of maintaining order. Mame listens without interrupting, then strips away the glamour of his reputation with surgical precision. She doesn't ask him to choose between her and the streets. She attacks the foundation of his self-image, asking him to choose between the man he currently is and the man he could become. Her ultimatum contains no threats of leaving, no emotional manipulation, just cold assessment delivered with devastating clarity. I won't love a criminal, but I might love a man who protects his community. Figure out which one you want to be. The transformation begins immediately through systematic restructuring. Bumpy refocuses operations on policy numbers and legitimate protection services, eliminating drug trafficking from his portfolio and establishing strict rules about violence against community members. Enforcers who enjoyed brutality for its own sake find themselves unemployed or worse. The new code spreads through his organization. Harlem's money stays in Harlem, children remain off limits, violence becomes surgical rather than recreational. Their marriage in 1932 is a small ceremony attended only by people who understand the truth. Mame Johnson is not decoration or a mob wife who looks away from blood. She is a partner with veto power over operations, moral authority over decisions, and the final word on what her husband becomes. 3 years later, federal agents arrest Bumpy on tax evasion charges. As they lead him away in handcuffs, Mame whispers something that makes him stop struggling. "Every day you're gone, I become someone else." Make sure you remember who you're coming home to. Between 1935 and 1945, Ellsworth Johnson belongs to the federal government. Atlanta, Lewisburg, Alcatraz. The facilities change, the concrete walls shift in color and thickness, but one constant remains. His body is caged while his reputation continues operating in the free world. Outside, Mame Johnson refuses to freeze herself in the amber of waiting. She moves systematically, step by calculated step, building an empire that requires no violence, no threats, no connection to the underworld that swallowed her husband. The primary battlefield becomes correspondence, a form of psychological warfare conducted through the United States Postal Service. Bumpy writes obsessively, filling pages with desperate declarations, detailed memories, transparent attempts to maintain control across impossible distances. His letters arrive weekly, sometimes twice weekly, pouring emotion onto paper with the intensity of a man watching his foundation crumble through steel bars. Mame responds monthly with updates written in the detached tone of a business associate filing quarterly reports. She describes community meetings attended, real estate investments completed, social organizations joined. Her letters contain facts without sentiment, progress without longing. The contrast devastates him more effectively than any physical punishment the prison system administers. Mame enters Harlem's real estate market with money saved from Bumpy's operations and her own employment, purchasing properties and establishing herself as a formidable businesswoman. She joins community boards, organizes tenant associations, sits on church committees. Her reputation grows independent of her husband's name. People begin seeking her counsel on neighborhood disputes, business ventures, political endorsements. She becomes Mrs. Mame Johnson, not Bumpy's wife, but a woman whose authority derives from competence rather than association with violence. Each position grants her new information channels. Each committee vote translates into leverage. Inside prison walls, Bumpy enforces a sacred code regarding his wife. Other inmates learn through brutal education never to mention Mame's name without absolute respect. When a new arrival smuggles in a photograph and another prisoner makes a crude comment about her appearance, Bumpy's response is immediate and exemplary. By the time guards restore order, the lesson is permanent. They can insult Bumpy, Harlem, or his operations and survive to see dinner. They mention his wife incorrectly once, and they risk leaving the yard on a stretcher. The critical test arrives in 1943 through a letter that breaks Mame's established pattern. Buried between updates about rent strikes and church initiatives is a single paragraph that detonates in Bumpy's cell. She has been offered a position in Washington, D.C., working with a civil rights organization focusing on housing discrimination and voting rights. The letter contains no request for his opinion, no performance of loyalty, no invitation for discussion. Just notification delivered with the same businesslike tone she has maintained throughout his incarceration. Bumpy's response reveals the depth of his desperation and the limits of his transformation. He activates criminal connections that still function despite his imprisonment, reaching through prison walls to orchestrate sabotage. Associates receive instructions to pressure the organization, spread rumors about Mame's associations with organized crime, make funding uncertain. The job offer quietly disappears with vague explanations about budget constraints and organizational restructuring. When Bumpy walks free in 1945, he expects gratitude for his protection, anticipating a wife who waited faithfully. Instead, he finds a woman holding documentation. Mame has spent months tracing the interference back to him with forensic accuracy, following threads of coincidence until they revealed systematic manipulation orchestrated from a prison cell. In their first private moment, she presents evidence like an indictment, letters, dates, testimony from people who witnessed the pressure campaign. Her judgment arrives without raised voice or theatrical anger, just devastating clarity about what his actions revealed. You were so afraid of losing me that you tried to cage me. Now you have to prove you deserve the key. Between 1946 and 1952, Ellsworth Johnson performs the most complex reconstruction of his life, rebuilding a criminal empire while simultaneously deconstructing his own assumptions about power, authority, and marriage. The streets welcome him back with familiar deference, old associates eager to resume profitable arrangements, rivals calculating whether his decade-long absence has dulled his edge. His wife greets him with conditions that transform their relationship from partnership into something resembling supervised probation. Respect, Mame makes devastatingly clear, is not a trophy earned once and displayed forever on a mantelpiece. It requires daily maintenance, constant proof, perpetual demonstration that the man she married still exists beneath the reputation he wears like expensive armor. The new operational framework strips away Bumpy's autonomy in ways that would humiliate most men in his position, but he submits because the alternative is losing her entirely. Mame demands complete transparency in all business decisions, requiring detailed briefings about operations, associates, and financial flows with the precision of a federal auditor. She claims veto power over any activity affecting the community, transforming herself from observer to gatekeeper with absolute authority. Most significantly, she asserts the right to redirect criminal profits toward legitimate community investments, treating Bumpy's earnings as resources requiring her approval for allocation. These are not suggestions or preferences but non-negotiable terms for continuing their marriage. Under this new governance, Bumpy's operations evolve systematically. Policy numbers remain the foundation, still technically illegal but now functioning almost like a community development fund disguised as gambling. Profits that once purchased exclusively luxury cars, jewelry, and influence now flow into scholarship programs sending promising Harlem children to college, low-interest loans helping families open barbershops and restaurants, and community protection services that keep predatory outsiders away from vulnerable residents. Mame maintains ledgers tracking every dollar with accounting precision that would satisfy any legitimate business. Resistance emerges immediately from within his organization. Longtime lieutenants, men who built their careers on violence and intimidation, question why the boss's wife sits in on strategy meetings, why she vetoes profitable ventures, why community welfare suddenly outweighs personal enrichment. Marcus Tick Robinson attempts to circumvent her authority by running a loan sharking operation targeting struggling families after Mame explicitly forbids it. Bumpy's response is surgical and public. Tick loses 3 fingers and his position, with Bumpy personally delivering the message that disrespecting his wife carries consequences worse than betraying the organization. The hierarchy of loyalties becomes clear to everyone. Mame sits at the top, untouchable and absolute. The ultimate test arrives in 1950 when 2 federal agents approach Mame outside Mount Olivet Baptist Church, presenting an offer wrapped in concern for her safety. They promise immunity from prosecution, witness protection, relocation to any city she chooses, and a clean break from her husband's criminal activities. All she needs to do is testify about his operations, associates, and financial arrangements. Mame refuses without hesitation, but she transforms the attempted recruitment into supreme leverage. That evening, she presents Bumpy with evidence of the approach and a new ultimatum. Federal interest proves his operations remain too visible, too vulnerable, too connected to activities that could destroy everything they have built. The negotiation lasts 3 days. Bumpy agrees to gradually transition from criminal enterprises to legitimate businesses, with Mame overseeing every phase of the transformation. During these conversations, the psychological dynamic crystallizes. Bumpy realizes his fear of Mame has nothing to do with physical harm or abandonment. What terrifies him is her capacity to look at him and revoke respect, to judge him morally inadequate. By 1955, her authority is absolute, visible to everyone when she publicly judges Heavy Williams at Wells Restaurant. Between 1955 and 1960, Mame Johnson's influence metastasizes beyond her marriage into the operational Dina of Harlem's Underworld, transforming scattered criminal enterprises into something resembling a shadow government operating under moral constraints. What begins as one woman's authority over her husband evolves into systematic law governing an entire criminal ecosystem. The transformation is surgical, irreversible, and terrifying to traditional gangsters who built careers on chaos and intimidation. The operational changes manifest through 3 systematic shifts that initially confuse rivals and federal agents alike. Violence transforms from routine management tool into surgical instrument, deployed with precision rather than emotional impulse. Community protection takes absolute precedence over profit maximization, meaning lucrative opportunities face rejection if they destabilize neighborhood welfare. Every criminal activity undergoes evaluation through dual criteria: financial viability and moral acceptability as defined by Mame's unwavering standards. This framework sounds absurd until competitors witness its effectiveness in building loyalty that money cannot purchase. Specific cases demonstrate Mame's veto power overruling Bumpy's street instincts with devastating finality. When heroin trafficking presents irresistible profit margins in the late 1950s, associates present compelling financial arguments, astronomical returns, insatiable demand, competitors already establishing distribution networks. Bumpy calculates the mathematics and sees opportunity. Mamie sees poison destroying the community they claim to protect. Her verdict arrives in 3 words: absolutely not, ever. The discussion ends permanently. When loan sharks under Bumpy's umbrella begin targeting struggling families with predatory interest rates during seasonal layoffs, Mamie eliminates the entire operation despite its profitability. She redirects those enforcers toward legitimate debt collection, effectively creating community insurance funded by protection payments from successful businesses. The ripple effects extend beyond Bumpy's organization through strategic imitation. Other criminal factions, initially mocking this supposedly soft approach, notice unexpected advantages. Witnesses refuse police cooperation, community members actively shield operations from law enforcement scrutiny, and profits become remarkably consistent rather than explosive but volatile. Neighborhoods protected rather than preyed upon don't welcome outside competition. Rivals begin quietly adopting similar codes, recognizing that Mame Johnson has accidentally discovered sustainable organized crime through community consent rather than community fear. Federal authorities respond with confusion and mounting frustration. FBI surveillance reports from this period reveal agents struggling to categorize Mame within existing criminal enterprise frameworks. She attends no meetings with known criminals, handles no contraband, participates in no illegal transactions. Yet informants consistently identify her as the de facto moral authority whose approval determines operational decisions. The Bureau increases scrutiny desperately, seeking leverage against the woman they now view as the organization's true stabilizing force. But her power derives entirely from voluntary submission rather than criminal conspiracy. The marriage dynamic solidifies into psychological complexity that baffles observers. Bumpy's fear of Mame's disapproval becomes his primary motivating factor, superseding profit, territorial expansion, or reputation maintenance. He evaluates every decision through the lens of her potential judgment, measuring choices against standards she established through patient conditioning. Associates learn to frame proposals in terms of community benefit, knowing the boss will inevitably ask what Mame will think. When Brooklyn rivals attempt exploiting Bumpy's perceived weakness by targeting Mame directly, assuming her influence has made him soft, they miscalculate catastrophically. Threatening his wife doesn't trigger negotiation, it unleashes systematic brutality that makes his previous reputation seem restrained. The response is scorched earth elimination. The threat, their associates, their infrastructure destroyed with terrifying efficiency. Bodies appear with notes reading, "Touch the Queen, lose the board." In 1960, everything shifts when Mame receives a medical diagnosis that forces the ultimate test of whether Bumpy's transformation represents genuine moral evolution or tactical performance designed to maintain her approval. Between 1960 and 1968, the inevitability that Ellsworth Johnson spent decades outmaneuvering arrives in a form he cannot intimidate, negotiate with, or eliminate. Mame's health begins deteriorating with methodical cruelty, transforming his greatest fear from abstract possibility into approaching mathematical certainty. The diagnosis arrives with clinical precision, doctors delivering timelines and treatment options while Bumpy sits beside hospital beds, realizing he faces an enemy immune to his reputation. This confrontation with biological inevitability triggers his final transformation, stripping away the last remnants of the street hustler who once believed power meant controlling outcomes through violence and intimidation. Succession planning becomes his obsessive architectural project during these final years, but not the traditional transfer of criminal enterprise. Bumpy systematically elevates lieutenants based on moral screening rather than capability testing, bypassing his most violent enforcers in favor of men who internalized Mame's framework as operational law rather than temporary inconvenience. He promotes associates who view community stability as strategic asset, who calculate long-term neighborhood consent over short-term profit maximization, who understand that sustainable power requires genuine legitimacy from the governed. Each transition includes explicit instructions, decisions affecting residents require the same moral scrutiny Mame would apply, profits continue funding scholarship programs and small business loans, violence remains surgical and defensive rather than predatory entertainment. He constructs an organization designed to outlive both his leadership and his wife's direct influence. Other criminal organizations throughout Harlem quietly adopt what federal surveillance reports begin calling the Johnson model, recognizing through painful trial and error that sustainable power requires community support rather than superior firepower alone. Policy operations that fund youth programs receive community protection from law enforcement scrutiny. Protection rackets that actually protect rather than exploit generate voluntary compliance and information sharing. Drug dealers who ignore these principles find doors closing, informants appearing, community elders steering young men toward operations aligned with protective rather than predatory frameworks. The transformation ripples through the underworld. Organized crime in Harlem evolves from parasitic exploitation into unofficial governance, filling gaps left by institutional racism and municipal neglect. The historical impact extends beyond criminal enterprise into community development infrastructure that persists decades later. Mame's influence on Bumpy created lasting frameworks, scholarship funds that continued operating after both their deaths, business loan networks that helped Black entrepreneurs when legitimate banks refused service, protection systems that kept more destructive criminal elements from establishing footholds in the neighborhood. Federal historians studying Harlem's economic development patterns consistently encountered Johnson fingerprints, though official records systematically erase their contributions to community stability and growth. Bumpy's death arrives on July 7, 1968, collapsing during a meal at Wells Restaurant, the same establishment where Mame once delivered judgment on Heavy Williams. He dies not in a hail of bullets, but from his own body's limitations, felled by a failing heart rather than enemy action. Witnesses report his final coherent words concerned not territorial disputes, outstanding debts, or criminal legacy, but specific instructions about ensuring Mame's continued financial security and physical safety. He dies calculating her comfort rather than his reputation, a final demonstration of completely transformed priorities. The aftermath reveals Mame's true power operating independently of the criminal infrastructure that initially amplified her influence. She continues wielding authority in Harlem's legitimate business and political circles for decades, serving on community boards, advising politicians, mentoring young entrepreneurs. People seek her counsel not because of her deceased husband's fearsome reputation, but because of her demonstrated judgment, strategic thinking, and unwavering moral clarity. She navigates the post-civil rights era with the same grace and steel that tamed the most dangerous man in New York, becoming Mrs. Mame Johnson in the fullest sense, a woman whose identity and influence derive entirely from her own competence and character. The final analysis requires confronting a paradox that confounds traditional understanding of power and fear. Bumpy Johnson faced down federal prosecutors armed with decades of prison time, rival gangsters wielding superior numbers and firepower, corrupt police officers threatening his operations and freedom. None of these adversaries truly frightened him because their threats remained external, manageable through strategy, violence, and negotiation. Mame terrified him because her judgment was internal, attacking his self-respect and moral identity rather than his physical safety or criminal empire. Mame Johnson never fired a gun, never issued a death threat, never built a criminal organization. But she accomplished what the FBI, rival gangs, and federal prosecutors never could. She made Bumpy Johnson afraid. Not of violence, not of imprisonment, not of death, but of moral judgment from the only person whose respect he needed to maintain his sense of self. That transformation of fear from external threat to internal conscience represents the most sophisticated form of power ever wielded in the American underworld. Mame Johnson didn't break Bumpy Johnson's heart. She gave him one. And in doing so, she became the only person he ever truly feared losing.